Hi, my name is Wendy Kline. I'm a historian of medicine at Purdue University, and I'm going to be speaking today about my current research project, which is on the history of LSD in the United Kingdom. And I'd like to thank Timmy Davis for organizing this panel. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. So, on April 25th, 1966, London-based psychiatrist R.D. Laing received ominous news from Dr. Freestone, a research manager at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals. The company, Freestone reported, had stopped its distribution of LSD in the United States a few weeks prior. And in the last few days, he continued, the pharmaceutical management of Sandoz Limited in Basel have come to the decision that no further distribution by Sandoz of any hallucinogenic drug shall be made anywhere in the world. Now, Laing was stunned. Sandoz had made LSD-25 available in the United Kingdom since 1953 and had been personally supplying Laing with the drug since 1961 for patient treatment. His orders had been small, typically a few dozen boxes every couple of months. The small orders were, quote, due to my desire to avoid any imputation that any LSD in my possession could fall into any other hands, he explained. This means, however, that I have no supplies of this drug to continue therapy for a number of my patients, among whom are several at a critical stage in their treatment, unquote. He therefore requested a final supply, believing Sandoz to be under an ethical obligation to fulfill this order. But Freestone's hands were tied. Sandoz could not fulfill Laing's order. The argument that LSD-25 is of value in psychiatry is well appreciated, he explained. It is realized that this sudden withdrawal may cause inconvenience, and for this we apologize. Nevertheless, in the present circumstances, no other course is open to us. The real problem, Freestone admitted, was that Sandoz was no longer in control of LSD production. In recent months, the situation in this country has followed that in the United States, he wrote, where illicit local manufacture, distribution, and usage has become rife. And here was the crux. This appears to have been associated with criminal activities, and severe adverse reactions have been reported in certain individuals. LSD was now in the wrong hands, and Sandoz wanted to keep theirs clean. Now, Laing disagreed with this rationale. You have no evidence which implicates Sandoz material in illicit use, and it seems extraordinarily unwise to withdraw illicit supplies of a drug because there is an illicit drug market, he argued. This seems to me likely only to aggravate the situation that it is hoped to mitigate. Now, Laing was a divisive figure in the field of psychiatry, known for his dramatic antics, heavy drinking, and controversial theories about madness and schizophrenia. Nevertheless, his opposition to Sandoz's termination of LSD production appears quite rational. Changes in the production, regulation, and media portrayal of LSD in the mid-1960s were wreaking havoc on legitimate psychiatric research and practice. It is disastrous for the medical profession, he noted, if the responsible therapeutic use of the drug is going to be impaired under pressure from irresponsible, illicit use of it on the one hand, and equally irresponsible publicity on the other, referring to the media's recent smear campaign against LSD. So while many scholars have captured this, quote, radical transformation of LSD from medical marvel to public pariah, unquote, in historian Erica Dick's words, I am interested in revisiting and complicating this historical moment, looking at it from the British perspective, which has, with some obvious other examples, has been largely ignored. I'm interested in the UK's national perceptions of itself versus others in a transatlantic context concerning LSD research and regulation. So back to my story. Laing could see the writing on the wall. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, and indeed UK regulatory policy, were succumbing to the rise in negative publicity surrounding recreational use of LSD. Scholars have found that between 1966 and 1968, news articles concerning LSD were quite different from the curious and balanced approaches of the early 1960s. They began to portray LSD as extremely dangerous, focusing on things such as axe murders and suicides. Lang, along with other scientists and clinicians who firmly believed in the drug's therapeutic potential, fought to maintain its legitimacy. By the late 1960s, however, this proved exceptionally challenging for figures such as Lang, who thrived on the adulation of the counterculture and adopted many of its tenets. While he did not believe that LSD should be made available to everyone, his unorthodox methods and his clientele hinted at the increasingly blurred boundaries between licit and illicit drug use. These blurred boundaries were becoming visible in London in the 1960s as a cultural explosion transformed the urban landscape. From high-end Mayfair to bohemian Chelsea neighborhoods, swinging London became the main trendsetter for many aspects of European youth cultures. Clubs, fashion boutiques, bookstores, art exhibitions, and of course, drugs attracted youth to London from all over the world. By mid-decade, LSD was widely available in London as a definite subculture of post-beatniks and psychedelic mods was springing up, forming the nucleus of the hippie movement. Novelist Edna O'Brien, raised in rural County Clare in the west of Ireland, experienced this scene firsthand and captured it in writing. She found herself drawn to swinging London and the Chelsea crowd when she moved to the area in the 1960s. And I should mention that she was also, for a while, a patient of R.D. Laing and tried LSD with him as part of her therapy. And in her case, it did not go very well. For O'Brien, the Chelsea scene helped to launch her career, but it also enabled her to capture the limitations it held for women, including herself. Her first novel, The Country Girls, focused on young Irish women on the run, poorly treated and virtually powerless, except by drawing on their sexuality and good looks. In the story, protagonist Kate Brady loses her mother and barely escapes her abusive alcoholic father by running away to Dublin in search of adventure with a friend. We had never seen so many people in our lives, reflects Kate upon their arrival in the city. We were dizzy trying to see the clothes in the shop windows. She quickly learns, however, that as a young woman, her freedom and power is limited to that time of the evening when she applies beguiling makeup for an elderly suitor. It is the only time that I am thankful for being a woman, that time of evening when I draw the curtains, take off my old clothes, and prepare to go out. I brush my hair under the light, and the colors are autumn leaves under the sun. I shadow my eyelids with black stuff and am astonished by the look of mystery it gives to my eyes. I hate being a woman, but I am happy at that time of night. I feel tender toward the world. I pet the wallpaper as if it were white rose petals flushed pink at the edges. I pick up my old tired shoes, and they are silver flowers that some man has laid outside my door. Now, Kate may have been a fictional character, but her circumstances were becoming increasingly common in 1960s London. A few blocks away from O'Brien's 6-bedroom house on Carlisle Square in Chelsea, an 18-year-old French girl by the name of Claudie Delbarre had lived in a modest top-floor bedsit on Walpole Street. We don't know whether O'Brien encountered Delbarre in the shops or clubs of Chelsea in the late 1960s, but images of her in the paper, along with her life story, reveal striking similarities between Delbarre and O'Brien's fictionalized Kate. Both ran away from home and country after the death of their mother around the age of 16. Both created an aura of mystery by shadowing their eyelids with black stuff that attracted the attention of elderly, wealthy men. Real-life Claudie appeared in photographs caked in makeup, her eyes surrounded with coal black eyeliner. And perhaps she was the more successful of the two. Friends of Claudie said that she was never without boyfriends and was always able to afford expensive clothes. Her best friend and fellow Soho club hostess, 21-year-old Kenyan-born Lucy Cardavillas, whom I believe is pictured here in this photograph. Claudie is at the center of the table, and on your left, I believe, is Lucy in the white hat. So Lucy noted that lots of photographers have been taking pictures of Claudie, affirming her desire to become a top model. Indeed, the head of one modeling agency remarked that as soon as I saw her, I recognized she had fantastic potentials. She seemed to embody the features of this new hedonistic, youthful, stylish culture. She was, as one journalist wrote, the girl who seemed to typify it all. If it weren't for the discovery of her lifeless body in her flat on a Tuesday morning in September of 1967, Claudie Delbarre may well have lived out her life anonymously, just one of many young girls seeking income, shelter, and perhaps a bit of excitement in a swinging London. But the aura of mystery created by Delbarre's stylish, seductive image, combined with her mysterious death, guaranteed that her story and image would be picked up by the press. She was first discovered by her landlord, concerned as to her whereabouts. He found her lying down on the bed, dressed in her bra and pajama jacket. Approximately 8 inches of a blue bed sheet had been stuffed into her mouth and down her throat. Extensive bruising of the scalp suggested that she had received at least 2 blows with a relatively heavy object. Cause of death, according to the pathology report, was suffocation following the cerebral haemorrhage and blows to the head. Now, when the story first broke, no one, including R.D. Laing, could have predicted that it would later serve to justify Sandoz Pharmaceuticals' rationale for terminating the manufacture of LSD. As a Sandoz research manager had explained to Laing back in 1966, the company was concerned about 2 things: the association with criminal activities and severe adverse reactions. As we will see, the death of Claudie Delbarre appeared to be the direct result of both of these concerns. Though R.D. Laing would serve as an expert witness in the trial, in an attempt to salvage the drug's reputation, he knew LSD's days as a legitimate therapeutic drug were numbered. British tabloids had a field day with Delbarre's death, initially suggesting her appearance held the clues. Miniskirt may have led to murder, the Daily Mirror declared 2 days after her body was discovered. Prominently featured at the center of page 1, her photograph tells its own story. Darkened, mysterious eyes, suggestively gazing downward, reflecting something either sultry or sad. She is leaning toward the camera, back arched, arms centered toward the front of her very short skirt, pulling it upwards to playfully suggest what lies beneath. The photo is seductive, mysterious, and now haunting as it takes on new meaning in the context of death. Just hours before her disappearance, the Mirror claimed, a policeman warned her about the shortness of her leather miniskirt as she stood outside the Chelsea Potter pub in King's Road, the haunt of swinging chicks, hippies, and flower people. The barman confirmed that Claudie told him about the policeman's warning, noting that Claudie always wore these fantastically short skirts. Was her own behavior to blame, or was she a victim? The Delbarre case emerged out of it after a decade of highly publicized press campaigns that sought to titillate and incense their readership through frank, shameful, and shocking exposés of the supposedly rampant vice in London. Soho, where Delbarre had worked as a club hostess, remained the most popular site for commercial sex. The press vacillated in its descriptions of Delbarre, referring to her as a model, a call girl, a good time girl, or a hostess. Regardless of which descriptor they selected, it was almost always preceded by her country of origin. She was a French model, a French hostess, or a French good time girl. She fit the stereotype at a time when foreign prostitutes continued to be imagined as French. But was she in fact a prostitute, or was she, like Edna O'Brien's character Kate, simply a young woman of the swinging 60s exercising sexual agency? While journalists entertained readers with their speculations about Delbarre, detectives combed London streets in search of answers. A special murder squad headquarters was set up in Chelsea, where she lived, and over 60 detectives were brought in for the investigation. Within days, they had interviewed over 250 people, including hippies and flower people, scouring nightclubs and shops on King's Road. And here's just a map of the section of King's Road that intersected with Walpole Street, which was Claudie Street, and a mapping out of some of the shops. And a couple of images of these shops on King's Road. Here's the Chelsea girl, and here's an image also on King's Road. Dozens of detectives raided the Speakeasy Club where Delbarre had last been seen at midnight on the following Saturday, where they questioned hundreds of people. They may not have discovered exactly what happened to Delbarre earlier that week, but they did gain a better sense of the elaborate social networks and connections surrounding illicit sex, alcohol, and drugs in the Chelsea neighborhood. These findings and their coverage in the press increased the visibility of these underground networks and contributed to a growing sense of moral panic. The crowd at the Speakeasy demonstrated how successfully Delbarre had worked her way into the highly exclusive club scene. The Speakeasy, which had opened in the previous year, was located in the Soho district. It was in the basement of the building and decorated in the style of 1920s Chicago, with life-size pictures of Al Capone and other gangsters, and some of the ugliest wallpaper ever made. But on that Saturday night, the room was filled with prominent figures. Among those interviewed during the midnight raid was the Honorable Henrietta Guinness, a member of the brewery family, described by one of her lovers as a profoundly troubled, highly sexual, extraordinarily lovely woman. I knew Claudie, she told detectives. She knew many of my friends. While interviews made it clear that Delbarre was well connected, the extent of her networks was revealed not through interviews, but from evidence in her flat. Murder squad detectives found 2 brown diaries filled with names and telephone numbers, along with photographs, postcards, and some 300 letters. The press suggested that these letters were from boyfriends in England and France, and that they were sprinkled with men's names. Of these, several were quite wealthy, with incomes over £10,000 per year. Armed with this evidence, detectives set out to interview these men, along with any friends who might be able to help shed light on her relationships. A mini-skirted girlfriend who went to the same West End clubs as Delbarre revealed that the deceased had received large sums of money from time to time. Others claimed that she made periodic weekend trips into the country and never told her friends where she was going, though she usually appeared in the West End the following Monday night. The real culprit, as it turned out, was not one of her listed sugar daddies, but a 37-year-old American man who had escaped back to the US shortly after his encounter with Delbarre. Detective Chief Inspector Fred Lambert, attached to the Chelsea police station, found glass tumblers on the floor of Delbarre's bedsit, one of which was broken. He sent the tumblers to the fingerprint branch at New Scotland Yard, where Detective Douglas Brandt discovered a fingerprint on a small piece of glass belonging to the broken tumbler. This was a significant development in the case for 2 reasons. First, the fingerprint matched that of Robert Lipman, who a week before the murder had been picked up for possession of cannabis and been fingerprinted. Second, the position of the fingerprint on the glass suggested that it was the murder weapon. The left forefinger was pointed down at a slight angle. As the prosecution later stressed to the jury during Lipman's trial, Lipman held it not in a normal way, but held it to use as a weapon. And the Crown will suggest to you undoubtedly that it is the weapon that was used twice to strike Claudie Delbarre on the head, rendering her unconscious, which was the first step on her unhappy road to death. With the fingerprint evidence, Scotland Yard issued a warrant for Robert Lipman's arrest on January 24th, 1968. Lipman had been found in a private mental hospital, the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut, where, according to one report, many Hollywood and Broadway personalities seek treatment. The legal procedure to extradite a US citizen on murder charges proved complex and time-consuming. In early March, Lipman was placed under arrest by a US Marshal with a warrant seeking extradition to the UK to face trial. In late April, US Secretary of State Dean Rusk endorsed a court order granting the British request for Lipman's extradition, an action that was allowed under a reciprocal treaty between the UK and the US in 1931, permitting extradition for capital offense. Lipman was the first American extradited under the treaty on a murder charge. Finally, on May 1st, Lipman was flown to London under the supervision of 2 Scotland Yard detectives and remanded in custody. And here's a photograph of their arrival at Heathrow Airport with, as you can see, Lipman under a blanket. During the following 5 months, prosecution and defense attempted to tease out what had actually happened on the night of Saturday, September 16th, 1967, the last time Delbarre was seen alive. Robert Lipman's testimony revealed that illicit drug use, and in particular LSD, played a key role in Delbarre's passing. Suddenly, the mysterious death assumed new meaning and significance, as it appeared to validate a new moral panic about the dangers of LSD and its growing presence in London's counterculture, despite the fact that it had become illegal to possess or distribute the drug on September 9th of 1966. And the only exceptions were doctors who could still prescribe LSD and use it in therapy. Given the fact that Sandoz had stopped manufacturing the drug back in April of '66, where was the drug coming from and what could be done to stop its spread? The short answer lay in West London, where a ready supply of illicit underground LSD continued to flood the market. But the more complex issue was figuring out how it got there. Undercover police scoured psychedelic hotspots beginning in early 1966, compiling a comprehensive dossier on LSD users and dealers, many of whom were not British citizens or who lived outside of the UK. British LSD evangelist Michael Hollingshead, who first introduced American Timothy Leary to LSD, sent a regular supply of the drug from the US, where he spent much of the 1960s, over to the UK, first to Scottish poet Alex Trokey, who was living in London's Notting Hill Gate. And then from Trokey, the drug flowed across London, including to New Zealand expatriate poet John Essam. Essam had arrived in London in the early 60s from Wellington and found space to live at 101 Cromwell Road in West Kensington. According to one historian, 101 Cromwell was filled with creative young people just arrived in London, hoping to transform their lives. Essam had enough LSD for thousands of trips on hand and another 4,000 concealed in a doorknob in a flat nearby. He became the main source of LSD before it was made illegal. And 101 Cromwell became a sort of LSD ashram in which several well-known musicians, including Paul McCartney and Mick Jagger, were known to have tripped. On April 6, 1966, John Essam became the first person in the UK to be charged with conspiracy to distribute LSD. The grounds for his arrest were unclear, given that at that time LSD was not yet illegal in England. But the prosecutor on the case noted that while the drug did not yet come under the Misuse of Drugs Act, he hoped it would soon. What was clear, he noted, was that Essam is in touch with people all over the world who are taking this drug. While Essam was later acquitted, concern over the global network surrounding the distribution of LSD led to regulatory reform. Britain's Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, believed that LSD was a dangerous drug that should be included in the Misuse of Drugs Act of 1964, which would make it illegal to possess, manufacture, or deal LSD. Among other things, this meant that the Customs Office was expected to police importation of LSD into Britain, despite the fact that they had little knowledge of what form LSD came in or how to identify or find it. Assuming that most LSD was coming from outside UK borders, it became all the more important to close them. By the time that Claudie Delbarre was found dead, LSD was not only readily available in London, but also a common household term. The Pretty Things, an English rock band, had written the first song with LSD in the title. That summer, LSD had begun to flood London, But where it was coming from was still a mystery. No LSD had been seized by customs and no hidden laboratories had been found. Police were frustrated as they had no clues as to who was producing it or how it was being distributed. The assumption, however, was that it was coming from the United States. Then came Robert Lipman's arrest for Delbarre's death and extradition from America. The timing could not have been more perfect, as his testimony implicated great acid from America as the culprit. For 36-year-old American Robert Lipman, Saturday, September 16, 1967, started off like most days. He woke up around 9 or 10 a.m. in his London hotel, smoked some hash, and took some methadone, his usual morning breakfast. He then headed over to Walpole Street, which was Delbarre Street, to his friend's house, where he smoked some opium and more hash. From there, he wandered up to King's Road for lunch, then ran into another friend, the Pretty Things drummer, Viv Prince. Together, they headed to a photographer's flat where they ground up amphetamine and sniffed it with 4 or 5 other people. Viv then took him to another friend's flat where they smoked more hash, bought some great acid from America, then walked to a pub for a few pints. Afterwards, they headed to Viv's house where they sampled the LSD, then to another flat to party with a handful of people. From there, the group traveled to meet another group of friends at the Baghdad restaurant on Fulham Road for dinner. Richard Saunders arrived late to the dinner, around 10:40 p.m. He, like Lipman, was an American in London to learn about filmmaking. He had been invited to the dinner by his American actor friend, Benny Carruthers, who was already there with 11 others, including both Robert Lipman and Claudie Delbarre. Claudie was wearing a long black dress with a black sequin jacket and carried a black silk coat and a black sequined evening bag. Saunders remembered that Claudie asked him whether he had any LSD, which he did not. But the query begs noting, and not just for the Lipman case. Dinner table conversations about the presence of illicit drugs in an upscale restaurant filled with artists, actors, photographers, and black sequined escorts suggested the extent to which drug consumption had become an accepted and collective activity among young middle-class people in swinging London. Studies showed that the proportion of UK drug users under the age of 20 increased from 0.6% in 1962 to 24.4% in 1966. Cannabis, which was mainly consumed among West Indian and African populations in London in the early 1960s, had by 1964 spread to white middle-class youth. This raised fears that this group, the future of the designated elite of the country, might be infected by a drug which was closely connected with being non-white. In addition, the presence of upwardly mobile foreigners distributing illicit drugs added to the moral panic that outsiders were intentionally destroying civilized culture. They were encouraging consumption of substances that brought about a loss of control, sexual hedonism, and even violence. After the meal, Saunders dropped Lipman off at the Knightsbridge Green Hotel, where Lipman smoked some more hash and then took a taxi to the Speakeasy Club, where he rejoined the dinner group. There, he gravitated towards Claudie Delbarre, and they began to dance together. And as you'll recall, this was the last place Claudie was seen alive. 6.5 feet tall and weighing 250 pounds, Lipman would have towered over Claudie, twice her weight as well as twice her age. He was mocked in the press as a buffoon with a fat wallet whose offbeat clothes were out of place for his age, and accused of trying at the age of 36 to be a young hippie. But on September 16, 1967, he had something that Claudie had been looking for: great acid from America. Lipman left the LSD pill back in his hotel, so he and Delbarre took a taxi to his hotel, picked up the drugs, and headed to Delbarre's top floor 2-room flat on Walpole Street around 4:15 a.m. Delbarre went into the kitchen to put the kettle on for tea, he recounted, while he picked out a record. She suggested he make himself comfortable, so he removed his boots, socks, and suede shirt. They then went into the kitchen to cut up his remaining pills of acid, one blue, one white, gave her 1/3 of the blue pill, saving the rest for himself and finishing off the white pill as well. He then sat down on the bed while she changed out of her long black dress and reappeared wearing only a bra and a pajama jacket. They lay down on the bed together and began to kiss. He intended to have sex with her, but suddenly, he recalled later, the trip started and I had no control after that. He later explained in court, we had been listening to some very weird music that I have never heard before other than in science fiction films, that type of music, and a strange feeling came over me that swept over my body. It started in my head, and as it went down my body, I sort of just left. There was no more me. It was as if I had gone dead in that part of my body, and it finally completely engulfed me. Then I was shot out into space. It was like I was on an electric current or electric circuit. I felt myself going along specific lines, and I was actually up in space in blackness. It was very weird, and I felt quite alarmed. From there, he recalls that he plummeted down towards the earth, which opened up, and I found myself going right down into the center of the earth, found myself in a pit of snakes, full of snakes. There were many of them. I don't know how many. They were very large, and they were entwining themselves around me. Fire was coming out of their mouths, and I realized I was in hell, fighting for my life. I was striking out at them, pulling them off of me. Space, snakes, and hell, fighting for his life. These experiences seem to affirm Sandoz Pharmaceuticals' prior concern regarding the potential for severe adverse reactions. Suddenly, Lipman regained awareness that he was physically present in Delbarre's Walpole Street flat, though he could not recall exactly where or what he was doing or how long he had been there. He saw Delbarre lying on the bed, but she didn't look right. Her face looked puffed up. I absolutely panicked, shocked, and I don't remember anything after that. He fled to his hotel, where he got into an ice-cold bath and finished off at least a half bottle of whiskey. The following day, he fled the country, returning to the US, where he checked himself into rehab at the $1,200 a day Hartford Institute of Living. It is hard to imagine how Robert Lipman could even function with the amount of drugs and alcohol he had ingested all day Saturday and into the early hours of Sunday, September 17th. But he had spent at least a decade as a high-functioning alcoholic and drug user with access to vast amounts of cash. Lipman's father was a Manhattan real estate millionaire whose holdings included the Flatiron Building on Fifth Avenue. In 1954, Lipman had married Lynn Sakowitz, heir to a wealthy Houston department store. They moved to Palm Beach, Florida, where Lipman tried his hand at real estate. But in Florida, Lipman appeared to grow unhappy. His drinking increased, and he engaged in extramarital affairs. One family friend claimed he'd heard that Lipman had slept with every girl from Texas to Florida. When Lynn finally fled the marriage in 1957, returning to Houston with their 2 young children, friends and family were shocked at her appearance. A friend recalled, Lipman had gotten her to bleach her hair platinum blonde, and she was wearing very red lipstick. She looked like a hooker. Did Claudie Delbarre resemble Lipman's ex-wife, or at least the way he wanted her to look? Is that what drew him to her? In the 10 years between his divorce and the death of Claudie Delbarre, Lipman's wild behavior continued to increase. By the mid-1960s, he was partying across Europe, traveling from Stockholm to Hamburg to London. Then he began experimenting with marijuana and harder drugs, which sometimes made him violent. Interestingly, this violent behavior was not recorded in the trial transcript. One night in the summer of 1967, while stoned, he stumbled over to his friend in a bar and hit him for no reason. His friend pleaded with him to get help, but Lipman instead headed to London to continue partying. It was there that he would meet Delbarre and his life would change forever. The LSD trip death, as one newspaper called it, captivated readers. They followed along as the defense asked the jury to, quote, Enter a world of grossly excessive drinking and the world of taking hallucinatory drugs. It is a very sordid, unrewarding, and self-destructing world we have to go into, unquote. One can imagine that not all of the 12 jury members grimaced at this proposal. Some probably welcomed the invitation to vicariously experience an LSD trip gone wrong. The case had all the makings of a great Hollywood murder mystery: a wealthy white American, the first to be extradited to the UK on murder charges, a beautiful French girl swept up in the swinging Chelsea scene. For some, it was a cautionary tale of the hedonism of hippie culture and an indication that LSD could kill. Yet the murder and the ensuing trial served as much more than a cautionary tale. It was a literal slamming of the doors of perception. LSD has traveled too far from its original therapeutic boundaries. By 1968, recreational use of the drug and its role in crime, the Lipman case becoming the jewel in the crown, symbolically transformed LSD from a therapeutic medication into an illicit and destructive drug sought out by addicts. This was not an inevitable shift by any means, but a highly situational one, brought on by a dramatic turn in the marketing and meaning of LSD. While other forces contributed to the downfall of LSD research, this case signified that LSD was perceived by the law not as a gateway to cosmic consciousness or spiritual hearing, but simply as a gateway drug. Sir David Napley, who had been practicing law since 1937, was assigned as Lipman's solicitor. He was committed to providing Lipman with a fair trial and indeed did not believe he should be convicted. But he also recognized that the drug scene in the UK by the late 1960s was not a pretty sight. In the year of Lipman's trial, there were 2,400 convictions, and Napley was constantly being consulted by those who had fallen foul of the law concerning prohibited drugs. Of the considerable number of cases he represented, he claimed that he could not recall a single individual who did not have some personality defect or inherent weakness leading to a reliance on illicit substances. Clearly, Napley was not an advocate for illicit drug use. Napley also believed that he knew who was to blame for the UK drug problem: the United States. While Mancunians say that what Manchester does today, London does tomorrow, he said, it is more correct that what America did yesterday, Britain does today. Then he continued by saying their drug problem, through the activities of the media in all of its form and that of the entertainment industry, was exported here. It was perhaps fitting then that the accused party in the first and only LSD murder trial in the UK was an American. Napley was assigned to the case in early May of 1968. He described Lipman as an exceedingly tall man, good-looking, with an excellent appearance and a quiet, well-modulated voice, which revealed a noticeable but not pronounced American accent. Napley asked Lipman to tell him his side of the story, quietly listening and interrupting only where he found some aspect difficult to comprehend. What Napley found most astonishing was the wide array of illicit drugs so easily attainable in London. Such access was unprecedented, and its presence in white middle-class neighborhoods, as exposed by the press, created a sense of moral panic. It also posed a challenge in the courtroom. What Lipman saw and experienced in Delbarre's flat in the early hours of September 17, 1967, could not actually assist either the prosecution or the defense to determine culpability, because he was hallucinating. Napley explained there is understandably little law on the subject of a person's responsibility for crime where his mind is affected by drugs. In preparation for the trial, Napley sought out and read as much literature as he could find on LSD and its effects. Under LSD, was Lipman even capable of killing another? I could find no history of violence by those under its influence, he reflected, an absence that would likely benefit his client. He therefore turned to the experts of the day, psychiatrists who administered LSD to their patients. They would be the most qualified, he believed, to understand and explain the effects of LSD. Their testimony would undermine the assumption that LSD could lead to violence, thereby calling into question Lipman's culpability. When the trial formally commenced on October 8th at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales in central London, Dr. Clifford Salter served as the key expert witness for Napley's defense team. Salter, a psychiatrist, first started administering LSD to patients in 1960 at Maudsley Hospital in London. Since then, he had primarily worked with alcoholics at Worlingham Park Hospital in Surrey. He estimated that he had conducted a total of approximately 400 LSD sessions to some 40 or 50 patients. As became clear in the questioning of Salter, the defense strategy was to undermine the claim that their client had struck Delbarre in the first place. Had Salter ever witnessed the sort of murderous violence the prosecution claimed Lipman exhibited in any of his patients? He had not. What about Lipman's recounting of his hallucinations? Was this unusual? It somewhat resembled accounts from his patients, but not to such a violent extent. As Salter explained, during these occasions, all that has happened from a point of view has been mild thrashing about on the couch, along with a feeling of being unable to move rather than of feeling strong. When asked to clarify, he explained, "The movement is never, in my experience, very excessive. I remember one man sat bolt upright and swung himself around 2 or 3 times on the bed and lay still again." Salter's experience suggested it might not be possible, much less probable, that Lipman was capable of physically assaulting Delbarre. Certainly, it was nothing Salter had seen before. This claim was further buttressed by statements from a second LSD expert witness, Dr. R.D. Lang. Lang was asked about his experience of aggression under LSD. Had he ever encountered a situation where somebody murdered somebody under its influence? No, he replied. In fact, he was asked, isn't there evidence that LSD actually reduces aggression? Yes, he agreed. Had it been considered for use in biochemical warfare because it tends to make opposing force less aggressive? Yes, he agreed. If it was perhaps unlikely that Lipman could have killed Delbarre, how did she die? The defense reminded the jury that Delbarre was not an innocent victim, but a complicit drug taker. Possibly because of her profession as a prostitute, argued the defense, she was already on hard drugs. The stereotype of the prostitute addict had begun to emerge in the mid-1950s as exposés painted prostitutes as criminals themselves, offering gross exaggerations and sometimes outright misinformation about prostitution in London in the 1950s. But the depiction of Delbarre as a drug user served as a reminder that illicit drug use in the counterculture was not limited to men. "It is not my function to blacken her name," he told the jury, "but it is right you should know this, because this is not the case of an older man trying to seduce an innocent girl and trying to persuade her to take drugs." The defense called on Dr. Salter to provide an alternative hypothesis for Delbarre's death, one in which she played a role in her own demise. Recall that Delbarre's body was found with 8 inches of bed sheet crammed in her mouth, resulting in asphyxiation. The presumption was that Lipman had forced it there. But what if he hadn't? The defense asked Salter if he had encountered any similar scenarios. "Yes," he responded. "There is one that comes to mind immediately. A patient of his currently undergoing LSD treatment had a session in which she complained of nausea and was given a towel and a bowl. He explained, it was sometime later on that she started screaming and between screams was stuffing the towel into her mouth with some rapidity and was in danger of harming herself. It was with great difficulty that I prevented her from continuing this process as her teeth appeared to act like hooks and allow of movement more easily inwards than outwards, but eventually I managed to disengage the material from her mouth. If Salter had not been there, he reasoned that she would have died. Claudie may have killed herself, read one newspaper headline the next day. Then it was the prosecution's turn. Under cross-examination, the prosecution pounced. LSD is a highly dangerous drug, is it not? They asked. Salter acknowledged that it was indeed, but also stressed the important role of the therapist who would supervise the encounter. So basically, it is so dangerous because of what people might do, asked the prosecution, not just to themselves, as in the case of Salter's patient, but possibly to others as well. Perhaps not as a frequent occurrence, but the danger is always there, is it not? It is this moment in the trial where the prosecution appears to take the upper hand, sealing the deal that not only is Lipman guilty, but that LSD is as well. The prosecution argued that the basic effect of LSD is to make the mind no longer master of itself. The mind, therefore, may dictate to the body in a wholly irrational way. Salter concurred, but emphasized that the effects on the body are typically limited, stating, if there are aggressive ideas expressed in his patient, it is limited to thrashing about in the way that restless persons would in their sleep. Can we be clear? The prosecution interjected. I am not necessarily dealing with your patients, but also with drug addicts in a general field. I think it would be wrong if we had the impression in this court that one takes LSD and then lies down in a state of euphoria, has a hallucination lying limp and virtually, to all intents and purposes, unconscious on a couch. While the defense had attempted to solicit evidence suggesting that LSD reduced aggression in its consumers, the prosecution refused to let go of the image of the violence inflicted on Delbarre. You see, doctor, one cannot escape from this fact, can one? In fact, on this Sunday or Monday, he appears to have been violent, excepting for a moment that he did hit the girl on the head with the glass. Will you accept that for the purpose of this question? If he did that, then he did behave in a violent way, a very violent way, did he not? Salter was forced to acknowledge this. Yes, this was a violent act, but I can only say in my experience using LSD in a treatment situation, they are not violent. This is not a treatment situation. The prosecution continued to try to force Salter to extrapolate beyond the patient population, to consider a man like Lipman, who had taken LSD some 15 to 30 times and never under supervision. But Salter resisted. I am talking about a particular kind of experience which I know, and that is in the clinical sphere. I am not an observer of the hippie at the time which he is doing this. Salter's acknowledgement that he was no expert when it came to dealing with LSD outside of the clinic served as a reminder that by the time of this trial, LSD was no longer under the control of mental health professionals. What if Lipman had been Salter's patient at the time of the LSD trip? He would have helped Lipman recover by trying to make sense of the hallucination. It often becomes possible to interpret to the patient what is happening in his fantasy life, to relate this to his childhood experience and unearth memories which he had completely forgotten. And this brings about a resolution of conflict, Salter explained, of how he helped his LSD patients. But Lipman wasn't seeking psychiatric treatment, at least not at the time. His hallucinations became not a therapeutic opportunity, but a crime scene. And suddenly, the courts were forced to solicit evidence and memories from someone who appeared to be on another planet. After hearing all of the evidence, Judge Helenius Patrick Joseph Milmo, known as Buster, instructed the jury on how to proceed. Milmo, according to one writer, had not come by his nickname lightly. He was aggressive, precise, pompous, and ruthless, once interrogating a colleague suspected of treason. He had previously been a member of MI5, the UK's domestic counterintelligence and security service, and had played a starring role for the prosecution in the Nuremberg trials. He was appointed a judge of the High Court in 1964, where he could, when required in certain cases, be extremely tough. This case was one of them. You will find the accused guilty of manslaughter, he told the jury. if you are satisfied, but of course only if you are satisfied, that it was his hand that inflicted the injury. After deliberating for shortly over 3 hours, the jury found Lipman guilty of manslaughter by a majority of 10-2, and he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Lipman filed an appeal contending that the jury should have been directed to consider the actual state of his mind at the relevant time. The appeal was dismissed. The Lipman murder investigation and ensuing trial, salaciously covered by the press, captured London in the midst of a moral panic. Previously, LSD had crossed borders freely, shared by research scientists eager to demonstrate the drug's therapeutic value. But by the 1960s, the drug traveled surreptitiously through the pockets of dealers, infecting the morals of Britain's white middle-class youth. Sensationalized reports in the popular press noted that it was not merely some working-class fringe kids taking drugs for pleasure in West End pubs, but white middle-class youth, as the proportion of drug users under the age of 20 skyrocketed. The Lipman trial appeared to confirm this, but it also provided a scapegoat. The tragedy that ensued on a late September night in 1967 stemmed from suspect outsiders: a wealthy American, a French good time girl, and great acid from America, who threatened the very social fabric of British culture. The American drug problem, reflected Lipman's solicitor, was exported here. This claim was further buttressed by a 1970 report by the Advisory Committee on Drug Dependence, confirming the earlier fears of psychiatrists such as R.D. Laing about what would happen after Sandoz stopped manufacturing LSD. The evidence suggests, the committee argued, that the illegal market in LSD in this country is supplied entirely by illicit manufacture. Clandestine laboratories manufacturing the substance have been discovered here, but probably the bulk of it is smuggled from the USA. But why? What was so special about the American market? They explained, we were told that users preferred the American LSD and regarded the English product as inferior. The great acid from America had infected Britain's youth, which was spiraling out of control in the new landscape of swinging London. The only solution, they concluded, was to eradicate the illicit use of LSD. Lipman's trial was the nail in the coffin. Thank you.